It's the story of Western civilization. The first great error was the urbanization. Well, I don't know, first great error. The invention of agriculture was a pretty staggering bad turn. Then urbanization. And then a piece of bad luck that really we didn't need to have befall us, which was the invention of the phonetic alphabet. And with the invention of the phonetic alphabet, we moved away from symbolism and lost even the symbolic connection to the world. And that happened with the evolution of Demotic Greek and even earlier languages, linear A and B and that kind of stuff. McLuhan talks a lot about this. I mean, we live in a universe so alienated that we can barely conceive of the way back. But hopefully, archaeology is a wonderful thing. I mean, we are actually, as I said to you last night, digging into the stratigraphic layers of our past and reconstructing these ancient intellectual machines and setting their gears turning and seeing how it works. And hopefully, when we recover, we're like amnesiacs. We're like people who don't remember who we are or where we came from, and we just wander mumbling through the streets of our cities, foraging in garbage cans and frightening other people. And yet, if we could wake up, and archaeology and the rebirth of an awareness of the goddess and the pushing of science to the point where its irrational foundations become more clear. This is all part of a program of awakening, of an archaic revival that will then make us part of the living world rather than a disease, a parasitic force upon it. This refers to the theme I touched on a little bit last night of the importance of the imagination and how I think that our destiny lies in the imagination. God is ever existent and makes manifest all else, but he himself is hidden because he is ever existent. He manifests all things but is not manifested. He is not himself brought into being in images presented through our senses, but he presents all things to us in such images. It is only things which are brought into being that are presented through sense. Coming into being is nothing else than presentation through sense. This is so thoroughly modern. It's just staggering. I mean, it's for 1,000 or 1,500 years, people couldn't say anything that clearly. It is evident then that he who alone has not come into being cannot be presented through sense, and that being so, he is hidden from our sight. But he presents all things to us through our senses, and thereby manifests himself through all things and in all things, and especially to those whom he wills to manifest himself. For though thought alone can see that which is hidden, inasmuch as thought itself is hidden from sight, and if even the thought which is within you is hidden from your sight, how can he, being in himself, be manifested to you through your bodily eyes? But if you have power to see with the eyes of the mind, then, my son, he will manifest himself to you. For the Lord manifests himself ungrudgingly through all the universe, and you can behold God's image with your eyes and lay hold on it with your hands. To my mind, this is the permission for the psychedelic experience, that we lay hold of the image of the ineffable through the eyes. If you wish to see him, think on the sun, think on the course of the moon, think on the order of the stars. The sun is the greatest of the gods in heaven. To him, as to their king and overlord, all the gods of heaven yield place. And yet this mighty God, greater than earth and sea, submits to have smaller stars circling above him. Who is it then, my son, that he obeys with reverence and awe? Each of these stars, too, is confined by measured limits and has an appointed space to range in. Why do not all the stars in heaven run like and equal courses? Who is it that has assigned to each its place and marked out each for the extent of its course? And then it goes on and on. And then here is an amazing modern anticipation of modernity. Would that it were not possible for you to grow wings and soar into the air. Poised between earth and heaven, you might see the solid earth, the fluid sea, and the streaming rivers, the wandering air, the penetrating fire, the courses of the stars, and the swiftness of the movement with which heaven encompasses all. What happiness were that, my son, to see all these borne along with one impulse, and to behold him who is unmoved moving in all that moves, and him who is hidden made manifest through his works. This is an image of the planet seen from space. I mean, it's absolutely the unified image of our planet. And it is, I think, the central image in this early Hermetic thing. This is the unifying, this is as close to an image of what Godhead is that they were able to reach. I mean, this is a shamanic flight that delivers a scientific description of the Earth moving in space. This was written AD 150. This is Book 5. Nobody had that insight until we reached Giordano Bruno. And if you read Giordano Bruno in the Hermetic tradition, you know that Bruno was burned at the stake. And the reason he was burned at the stake was because he looked up into the sky and did not see the stellar shells and the angelic hierarchies. Bruno had a mystical experience, and when it was over, he said, the universe is infinite. The stars go on forever. And that single statement was just the intellectual dynamite that destroyed the whole medieval, Hellenistic, the entire previous cosmological vision was left behind with that single statement. It was such a powerful statement that he had to go to the stake for that. And we have never recovered from that perception. It was a fundamental perception, and it occurred because he looked without precondition into the night sky and did not see, wheels and demons and angels and shells of cosmic fate and necessity. And he just said, that's bullshit. What is there is infinite space, infinite time. The stars are hung like lamps unto the utmost regions of infinity. And this then inaugurates the beginning of modernity. And it's a perception that arose on the foundation of all of this earlier thinking. Here's another passage on the imagination. Yes?
This somehow is the way of reaching the vision.
Well, the practice, we know a lot less about that because there was much secrecy around this. What we have are the philosophical discourses, and then when we talk about alchemy this afternoon, we'll see that there the technique becomes projection onto matter, that you enter into a kind of self-hypnosis where by having these what we call naive ontological categories, in other words, not being sure exactly how much of mind is in matter or how much matter is in mind, you can erase the boundary between self and world and project the contents of the unconscious onto chemical processes. Now, what went on in the early phase here, we don't know. The Hermetic, the Trismegistic hymns are largely as you see them here, philosophical discourses. There was stress on diet and purity. Asceticism was typical of the hermetic approach. In Gnosticism, it went one of several ways. There were schools of Gnosticism which were vegetarian and puristic. And then, because they felt that man was no part of the universe, that man was somehow hermetically sealed, if you will, hermetically sealed against contamination from the universe, some Gnostic schools said you can do anything you want. You can have any kind of sexual arrangement you want. You can do anything you want because you are not, do not think that you are part of the universe. And so you had Gnostic schools side by side, some orgiastic and quasi-tantric, and some ascetic. There were Gnostic sects that, you see, because the idea was that light was trapped in matter by the act of procreation, there were Gnostic sects that only practiced forms of sexual union that couldn't lead to conception. So there were presumably exclusively homosexual sects. There were sects which only practiced anal intercourse. And for them, that was the same as celibacy, because the real concern was not to trap any more of the light. And, you know, I don't seriously advocate this, but I think in our current situation of overpopulation, a little dose of this kind of thinking wouldn't be a bad thing. I mean, too much light is trapped in the organic matrix, and so and these Gnostic sects that, for instance, were exclusively homosexual or exclusively practiced anal intercourse, of course, they were suicide sects. They disappeared very quickly because they could only make converts by in missionary conversion. You didn't have children, you couldn't hand it on. But it shows, you know, how thoroughgoing their rejection of the world was, how contaminated they felt themselves to be by the material world. But then you also had, as I mentioned, these optimistic schools that saw nature as something to be perfected, and said man has been set onto the earth not to reject it, but to perfect it. And utopianism, the belief that one can create a perfect society, it goes back into these hermetic ideals, because the idea was that a perfect society could be the goal of the alchemical work. Let me read you a passage from Giordano Bruno. This is a wonderful passage from the Picatrix. Remember Picatrix? This was the book of 12th century magical texts that began to introduce these hermetic ideas. And this passage is the core passage that inspired the Rosicrucians and numerous other utopian movements. Here is Francis Yates. Hermes Trismegistus is often mentioned as the source for some talismanic images and in other connections, but there is in particular one very striking passage in the 4th book of Picatrix in which Hermes is stated to have been the first to use magical images and is credited with having founded a marvelous city in Egypt. And here is the passage from the Picatrix. There are among the Chaldeans very perfect masters in this art, and they affirm that Hermes was the first who constructed images by means of which he knew how to regulate the Nile against the motion of the moon. This man also built a temple to the sun, and he knew how to hide himself from all so that no one could see him, although he was within it. Now, those of you who are scholars of Rosicrucianism know that one of the things that was always said about Rosicrucians was that they were invisible. This was how Robert Flood proved to people that he wasn't a Rosicrucian. He'd say, "You're looking at me, so how can I be one?" And so he's in the temple, but he could not be seen within it. It was he, Hermes Trismegistus, too, who in the east of Egypt constructed a city 12 miles long, within which he constructed a castle which had 4 gates in each of its 4 parts. On the eastern gate he placed the form of an eagle, on the western gate the form of a bull, on the southern gate the form of a lion, and on the northern gate he constructed the form of a dog. Into these images he introduced spirits which spoke with voices, nor could anyone enter the gates of the city except by their permission. There he planted trees, in the midst of which was a great tree which bore the fruit of all generation. On the summit of the castle he caused to be raised a tower 30 cubits high, on the top of which he ordered to be placed a lighthouse, the color of which changed every day until the 7th day, after which it returned to the first color. And so the city was illuminated with these colors. Near the city there was abundance of waters, in which dwelt many kinds of fish. Around the circumference of the city he placed engraved images and ordered them in such a manner that by their virtue the inhabitants were made virtuous and withdrawn from all wickedness and harm. The name of the city was Adocentine. Now, what we're familiar with from the Platonic literature is a quasi-rational, largely rational approach to utopian thinking that you get in the Republic. However, students of the Republic will recall that the fifth or 10th book of the Republic contains the myth of which we went over in detail in the section I did on Neoplatonism. And the myth of is one of the most bizarre and puzzling passages in the entire ancient literature. You recall Er was a soldier who died. He was killed in battle. But after 8 days, he returned to life. And then he told a story that is the absolute puzzlement of ancient scholars. It's highly mathematical. It has to do with the spindle of necessity and the description of some kind of cosmic machine, and all the ratios of the gears of this machine are given, and nobody knows what is being talked about. But here we have a different thrust, a magical utopianism, and the idea of a perfected human society using magic, because these engraved images that he ordered in such a manner that by their virtue the inhabitants were made virtuous, that means he was able to deflect the energies of cosmic fate. The city was immune to astrological malefic influence. It was protected. And when we talk later about the alchemical aspirations of the Rosicrucians and John Dee and Frederick the Elector Palatine of Bohemia, we'll see that this impulse toward an alchemical kingdom returns again and again. In a way, utopianism is the four-gated city of utopian magical dreaming is one version of the Philosopher's Stone. It's a kind of diffuse notion of the Philosopher's Stone, but it's a society in perfect harmony with fully realized beings living within it, practicing a cosmic religion that frees them from the impulses of cosmic fate. The other thing that is going on in some of this alchemical imagery is a kind of subtext of late alchemy is what's called the ars memoria, the art of memory. And in fact, Francis Yates has a book called The Art of Memory. And this is a lost art. Literally, it begins with the Roman orator Cicero and was practiced up until the early 17th century. And what it consisted of was orators it was considered very bad form to read your speech if you were an orator. And so you had to memorize your speech, and there were tricks of memory. And the commonest mnemonic trick was to think of a building. It was called the Memory Palace. A building that is familiar to you. I've done this myself with the University of California because it's an area that I'm very familiar with because I was a student there, and there are many buildings and many hallways and many floors. And what you do is when you make your speech, in your mind you are moving through the memory palace, and at various points you construct what are called emblemata. And the idea of these emblemata is that they be as unusual, shocking, and unexpected as possible in order to be memorable to you. So say you're giving a speech about the 7 deadly sins. Well, so then luxuria might be for you a nun copulating with a dog, and you'll set the nun and the dog in a little niche in the hallway of the memory palace. Well, then when you reach that place in your imaginary journey, all these associations will spring to mind, and you will be able to give your speech flawlessly. To us, this sounds tortured and peculiar, but it works quite well. One of the great practitioners of the Ars Memoria was Giordano Bruno, and he wrote a book called Lo Specchio della Bestia Triunfante, The Expulsion of the Triumphant Beast. And my God, Max Ernst, eat your heart out. I mean, this is a surreal epic read as straight plain text, because that's not how it's supposed to be read. It's an agglomeration of these mnemonic emblemata that led him on then to probably give a fairly conventional disputation on one subject or another. But there are even old books of these emblemata that are before surrealism. These were some of the wildest images that the Western mind would tolerate. The one thing that we didn't get into this morning was talking about the astrological side of it and the role of the decans. The decans are these demons, 3 to a sign, so there are 36 of them. And this was thought to be an astrological conceit that goes back to Egypt, as opposed to the ordinary zodiacal significators, which go back to Haran in what is now modern Iraq. And these decans were the demons that were summoned by these Renaissance magi in an effort to control and manipulate fate. You may, if you were paying attention this morning, noticed that in all the reading I did from the Corpus Hermeticum, there was really nothing explicitly magical about it. It was philosophical. There was one mention, I think, of animating statues in the description of the four-gated city. But it was those magical animation passages that really captured the imagination of the Renaissance, and they built on that. And the idea, simply put, is that these decans and zodiacal signs are at the center of associative schemata, which include plants, minerals, odors, certain flowers, certain animals. Everything had its decanic assignation. And so if you were involved in promoting an affair with a woman or something like that, then you would do an invocation to Venus, and you would gather the associated minerals, stones, animals, and you would put them in a room, and then certain tonal modes were also associated with these things. And so you would play the music, you would have the flowers present, the minerals present, the invocations, and what you were trying to do is create a microcosm of the macrocosm to draw down this stellar energy. It wasn't about the classical Hollywood appearance of demons in a circle. That's the stuff of Picatrix, the earlier, somewhat less refined style of magic. Let's see. Yes. Oh, here it is. I did bring it. I wanted to read you one passage here from, this is Francis Yates again in Giordano and the Hermetic tradition, because this describes this change of status of the magician that we're interested in. And also what we didn't talk about this morning was the importance of Kabbalah, which came in quite late, but was then worked out in great detail. This was originally the idea, it was the Jewish contribution to this kind of magic. It was the idea that since the world had been made by Jehovah, by the speaking of words, in principio et verbo caro factum est. In other words, the speaking of Hebrew was thought to be the use of a primary linguistic tool for the purposes of creation. The problem for these Italians was very few of them spoke Hebrew, and so it was sometimes practiced silently. The mere constructing of these Hebrew letters and the setting out of messages in Hebrew was deemed efficacious as well. And then a further declension for people who were even frustrated with that was to channel magical languages which were pseudo-Hebraic in structure and appearance. And this is a whole branch of research, much too arcane for us to go into here. The only non-Hebraic magical language that I may mention will be Enochian. And Enochian was an angelic language channeled to John Dee and used by him in his magical evocations, and then later it was taken up by Aleister Crowley and the folks of the Golden Dawn. But there were many, many of these magical languages. The Voynich manuscript is written in one of them. But I want to read you this passage about how the Renaissance changed the status of the magician. We begin to perceive here an extraordinary change in the status of the magician. The necromancer concocting his filthy mixtures, the conjurer making his frightening invocations, were both outcasts from society, regarded as dangers to religion, and forced into plying their trades in secrecy. These old-fashioned characters are hardly recognizable in the philosophical and pious magi of the Renaissance. There is a change in status almost comparable to the change in status of the artist from the mere mechanic of the Middle Ages to the learned and refined companion of princes of the Renaissance, and the magics themselves are changed almost out of recognition. Who could recognize the necromancer studying his Picatrix in secret, in the elegant Facchino with his infinitely refined use of sympathies, his classical incantations, his elaborately Neoplatonized talismans? Who could recognize the conjurer using the barbarous techniques of some Clavus Salomonus, in the mystical Pico, lost in the religious ecstasies of Kabbalah, drawing archangels to his side? And yet there is a kind of continuity, because the techniques are at bottom based on the same principles. Ficino's magic is an infinitely refined and reformed version of pneumatic necromancy. Pico's practical Kabbalah is an intensely religious and mystical version of conjuring. So now we move in this realm. I mean, these were the companions of princes, and there was, in that 120 years, from let's say 1500 to the beginning of the 30 Years' War, a constant effort in various parts of Europe to try and turn European society toward a kind of magical revolution. I mean, the Europe of the 11th and 12th century was entirely ruled by scholastic rationalism. Witchcraft was virtually unknown and very curious. It's the 15th and 16th century where you get this tremendous proliferation of magical systems, magical ideas, and social hysterias related to witchcraft, alchemy, conjuring, and magic. I mean, those are the centuries when these things really broke out into the open. And alchemy in that period is basically a story of personalities. Wonderful personalities, too many for us to really talk about in detail. I mean, we have Nicholas and Partenelle Flamel, who sought and found the Philosopher's Stone, according to legend, and according to legend are living to this day somewhere in Central Asia in perfect happiness, having achieved not only the chemical wedding, but the water stone of the wise. And then we have Basil Valentine, who refined red wine and distilled it in distillation apparatus until he got essentially pure alcohol. And upon drinking this, he was so convinced that he had found the Philosopher's Stone that he announced the imminent approach of the end of the world based on his discovery. And he was not secretive at all. He propagated his recipes and in fact sampled the distillates of some of his brother alchemists and popularized this very widely. To this day, the reason certain cognacs are in the hands of monastic orders and no one else can make these things is because they were originally alchemical secrets. And many of these early alchemists were men of the cloth, quite a number of them. So what I thought I would do is, in a highly chaotic fashion, read you some of this alchemical literature. Now, the big bring down about alchemical literature is that apparently the muse didn't always smile on the alchemist, and some of this poetry is pretty tormented stuff. Why this is, who can say? But let's try one here and see if you can bear with it. Also, my Middle English is not as good as it might be. This is a short one and typical, and you will see why the alchemists were charged with unbearable obscurity and prolix prose. This poem is called A Description of the Stone. Though Daphne fly from Phoebus bright, yet shall they both be one. And if you understand this right, you have our hidden stone. For Daphne, she is fair and white, but volatile is she. Phoebus, a fixed god of might, and red as blood is he. Daphne is a water nymph, and hath of moisture store, which Phoebus doth confine and heat, and dries her very shore. They being dried into one, of crystal flood must drink, till they be brought to a white stone, which washed with virgin's milk, so long until they flow as wax, and no fume you can see. Then have you all you need to ask. Praise God and thankful be. This is a recipe for the production of the philosopher's stone. And the author, I'm sure, felt that he'd spoken as clearly as he dare speak. And yet, making something of this is no easy task. This is from the Theatrium Chemicum Britannicum and the late phase of alchemy. Here's another one. The world is a maze, and wot you why? Forsooth of late a great man did die, and as he lay a-dying in his bed, these words in secret to his son he said. My son, quoth he, 'tis good for thee I die, for thou shalt much the better be thereby. And when thou seest that life hath me bereft, take what thou findest, and where I have it left, thou dost not know, nor what my riches be. All which I will declare, give ear to me. An earth I had all venom to expel, and that I cast into a mighty well. A water eke to cleanse what was amiss, I threw into the earth, and there it is. My silver all into the sea I cast, my gold into the air, and at the last into the fire, for fear it should be found, I threw a stone worth 40,000 pound, which stone was given me by a mighty king, who bade me wear it in a fourfold ring. Quoth he, this stone is by that ring found out, if wisely thou canst turn this ring about. For every hope contrary is to other, yet all agree, and of the stone is mother. So now, my son, I will declare a wonder, that when I die, this ring must break asunder. The king said so, but when he said withal, although the ring be broke in pieces small, an easy fire shall soon it close again. Who this can do, he need not work in vain, till this my hidden treasure be found out. When I am dead, my spirit shall walk about. Make him to bring your fire from the grave, and stay with him till you my riches have. These words a worldly man did chance to hear, who daily watched the spirit, but nae the near. And yet it meets with him and every one, yet tells him not where is the hidden stone. Now, this stuff is obscure. It's deliberately obscure. It was obscure to its contemporaries. And the whole effort became one of collecting this kind of material and finding it out. And you have to understand, this was all circulating in manuscript. Very little of this was printed. The Theatrium Chemicum Britannicum was not printed until 1652. So this was a world without vehicular transportation other than the horse and carriage. And these people were paranoid of being discovered and persecuted for wizardry and witchcraft by the church. So each alchemist, working in secret with a limited number of texts, with a local control language, created this vast conceptual patchwork of ideas. And this is in large measure responsible for the obscurity of what is said. Then another factor which impinges on this and further complicates the matter is that the name of the game was projection of the contents of the imagination onto physical processes. So taking red cinnabar, which I mentioned last night, and heating it in a furnace until it sweats mercury, for one alchemist, this is the incineration of the red salamander and the collection of our Mercurius in the great pelican. They named their chemical apparati after animals and gods, and so the pelican is a standard distillation apparatus, basically a condenser on top of something which is boiled. And then these materials would be collected ground, powdered, refired, mixed with other materials, refired again. And in the process, these people were, we call it, I mean, it's such a weak term, the projection of the intellect into this dimension. They were living in a waking dream. And many of the recipes are designed to wipe out the boundaries between waking and sleeping. Remember I talked about the river of mercury that runs between the yin and yang? Many of the alchemical processes were of 40 days duration. Well, you can imagine a hermit fearing discovery by the church, trying to keep his fires not too hot, not too cold, working day after day, night after night. Eventually, all boundaries dissolve, and you're just living in a pure world of intellectual projection. And then, in the swirling of the alembic, in the chemical processes going on in the retort, you begin to be able to project your conscious onto this. It's what we call visualization. But for us, it's a kind of a weak term, because we are never really able to, except in the psychedelic state, to transcend the belief in the inner world and the outer world being somehow separate. So for us, it's always separate from us. But they were able to wipe out that boundary. Well, then, what they saw in their swirling retorts and alembics was not carbonization, calcination, condensation of various molecular weights of liquids and oils out, but rather the birth of the red lion, the coming of the eagle, the appearance of the smaragdine stone. They had hundreds and hundreds of these words, and I didn't bring any with me, but much alchemical literature are dictionaries. Martinus Rulandus's Alchemical Dictionary is a huge book of words with special meanings in the alchemical context. And these... Okay, so why? Why do this? And what happens when you do it? Well, no matter what alchemist you're reading, there's always an agreement that there are stages in the great work, stages in the opus, as they called it. And you can't get any agreement on in what order these stages come. But roughly, it's something like this. Most agree that it begins in the negredo, the blackening, our crow, the saturnine world of what we would call manic depression, despair, and that our chaos, a chaotic, near psychotic state of unbounded hopelessness, and that is the precondition then for the alchemical work. Though the stages of the opus never occur in order. I had a dream last night that was, I think, triggered by an illustration in Fabricius that I'll show you tonight. But it was a classical alchemical dream. It was that I was at a country fair, and its antiquity was indicated by the fact that it was happening on the schoolyard of my childhood. And as I moved among the participants of this country fair, I began to notice that they were freaky. I mean, there were people with withered arms, and one side of their face slid down, and so forth and so on. The whole thing began to drift toward nightmare. And Richard Hermes Bird appeared in my dream as my alchemical compadre, and at one point a black woman, perfect symbolism for the negredo, a black woman with 3 withered arms and 6 or 7 breasts slid herself sideways in front of me. And it was at that point that I went and found Richard and said, I think we better get out of here. Well, now, an alchemist would greet a dream like this with great anticipation and joy, and would understand that this sets the stage now for the next movement forward. Well, then accounts differ, and those of you who really want to get into this, I recommend you read Mysterium Conjunctiones by Jung, the mysterious conjunction. And he discusses the negredo in great detail. Another symbol for the negredo is the senex, the old man, because the old man is just short of death, and that's the state that the negredo makes you feel. Well, then you must take this raw, chaotic, unformed material, often compared to feces, compared to corruption, compared to the contents of an opened grave, and you must cook it in the alchemical fires of contemplation, prayer, and ascetic self-control. And then you will move through a series of stages that are associated with colors. There is the rubedo, the reddening. There is the citrinitas, the yellowing. There is the viriditas, the greening. And the order in which these occurs differs according to who you follow. But then there is closure at the end of the process. Most alchemists, although certainly not all, agree that the higher state is the albedo, the whitening, the purificatio. Right? So at each stage, there are sub-stages of dissolution, dissolutio, et coagulatio. And there's one alchemical aphorism that says, dissolutio et coagulatio, know this, and this is all you need to know. And so it's a melting and a recasting and a purifying of psychic contents. Well, then so finally you reach the albedo, the whitening, the highest stage, the stage of great purity. But remember how I said last night that Mercury was always the metaphor for mind in alchemy, or one of the metaphors for mind in alchemy, and I talked about its mutability and its ability to take the shape of its container, and when you shatter it, it then splits into many reflections. So once you move into the domain of the albedo, the whitening, then a whole new problem arises for the alchemist. And this is the problem of the fixing of the stone. Somehow the mutability of Mercury must be overcome, and it must be crystallized. It must be fixed so that it doesn't get away from you, so that it doesn't slip through your fingers. To achieve our Mercury is nothing unless you have the secret of the coagulatio. And so then there's a huge amount of effort devoted to this. Well, what is being described is what Jungians call the individuation process, a dissolving of the boundaries of the ego, an allowing of the chaotic material of the unconscious to pour forth where it can be inspected by consciousness. And we'll see tonight when we look at this art that these images are full of ravening beasts, incestuous mother-son pairs, incestuous brother-sister pairs, hermaphrodites. All taboos are broken. This stuff just boils up from the unconscious, then is sublimed through these processes, and then is somehow fixed. And this fixing, then, is the culmination of alchemy. And if you can bring off this trick, then you possess our stone, the philosopher's stone, the lapis, the Sophic hydrolith of the wise, Irenaeus Philalethes calls it. And there were hundreds of control words for naming the secret difficult to obtain. Alchemical gold, in short. This is what we're after. And if you possess it, nothing else is worth anything, because it is psychic completion, peace of mind, Jung called it the self. It's the self that we are trying to recover. And remember, we talked about the Gnostic myths of the light trapped in matter. Well, this is the lumine de lumine. This is the light of light, the lux natura, the light drawn out of nature and condensed into a fixed form, which then becomes the universal panacea. And I'm using as many of these alchemical terms as I can draw out of my memory to give you a feeling for it. This is the universal medicine. It cures all ills. It brings you riches, fame, wealth, self-respect. It's the answer. It's what everyone is looking for and no one can find, you see. So this just became a consuming passion of the 15th and 16th century mind. And they thought they were on the brink of it. And along the way, they were discovering stuff like distilled alcohol, phosphorus, gunpowder. All of these things were coming out of the alchemical laboratories, but that was not it. You see, they kept driving themselves onward because they knew that that this was not the real thing, and they were pursuing the real thing. Well, then, for some people, it became then reassociated with this notion of the utopia that I mentioned this morning in the passage that I read about the city of Hermes Trismegistus. And they began to see, it's almost like the crisis which overcame Buddhism. It must be an archetypal, and notice how rarely we've used that word here. It must be almost an archetypal stage in human thought. You know, Theravadan Buddhism stressed individual redemption through meditation on emptiness. And then, with the great reforms of Nagarjuna, the idea of bodhisattvic compassion was introduced, and that carries with it a political freight, an obligation to society and mankind. And so as the 15th and 16th century progressed, there began to be this awareness that what was wanted was not for an alchemist to break through to his own personal salvation, but somehow to create an alchemical world. And you get then the notion of the multiplicatio, the idea that the stone, once created, will replicate itself and be able to change base matter into itself in almost like a virus spreading through the ontological structure of matter itself, and the world will be reborn. And this idea then, what was happening was these alchemists were getting bolder, and printing was invented in Mainz near Frankfurt in 1540. The distribution of these alchemical books was changing the character of alchemy. It was no more the solitary hermit working away in his cave or mountaintop, far away from the minions of the church. These alchemists began to dream of banding together, of forming societies, of creating brotherhoods that were united in the sharing of their knowledge and their purpose. And this brings us to the curious episode in history called the Rosicrucian Enlightenment. And Dame Frances Yates, once again, got there first, and she wrote a book called The Rosicrucian Enlightenment, which traces the history of these alchemical brotherhoods and reveals to us what they were really about. And what they were about was this dream of somehow taking the Philosopher's Stone and the power, the immortality, the insight that it would bring, and making it a general utility of mankind. And in the, one way of looking at modernity, I mean, I have a friend who claims that the summoning of the Holy Spirit into matter can be seen as the creation of the modern world of electrical energy. That people like Helmholtz and Faraday were completing the alchemical work. It's very hard for us to realize how mysterious the electromagnetic field seemed to the 19th century. The 19th century had entirely imbued itself with the spirit of Democritean atomism translated through Newtonian physics. And they believed, that everything was little balls of hard matter winging through space. Well, when Helmholtz and Faraday and these people began to talk about action at a distance and generating the electromagnetic field and trapping lightning in Leyden jars and running it through wires, what could this be but pneuma? What could this be but the trapping of spiritus? What could it be but the literal descent of the Holy Ghost into history? And, give it a moment's thought. For thousands of years, electricity was something that you saw when you took an amber rod and a piece of cat fur and went into a darkened room and stroked the cat fur, and then when you would bring the amber rod close to the cat fur, you would see the crackle of static electricity through the cat fur. For thousands of years, that's what electricity was. Who would dream that you could light cities, that you could smelt metals, that you could illuminate the earth with this energy? And yet, from the 1850s to the present, this was done. It's almost a literalizing, the final literalizing of the alchemical dream. But to go back now, I digress, I fear. Let's go back to the climate of the 1580s. And the central culprit here, and to my mind, a giant figure casting an enormous shadow over the landscape of alchemy and modern science, is the Englishman John Dee. John Dee united in himself the complete spirit of the medieval magus and the complete spirit of the modern scientist. He invented the navigational instruments that allowed the conquest of the round earth. When Francis Drake sailed up the coast of California, he had navigational instruments that were top secret. The French, the Spanish must be kept away from this stuff, and these were navigational instruments created by John Dee that allowed him to locate himself anywhere on the globe. But John Dee was a man who, on a late summer evening in Mortlake, in his house in Mortlake outside London, the angel Gabriel descended into his garden and gave him what he called the show stone, S-H-E-W in Old English, the show stone. And the show stone exists to this day. You can see it in the British Museum. And what's amazing about it is it's a piece of polished obsidian. It's an Aztec mirror, is what it is. And there was a ruler of the Aztecs named Smoky Mirror. How John Dee got this thing, we cannot even imagine. I mean, he says he got it from an angel. Nobody can really say that. However, I suspect that Cortez, on his first return to Spain from the New World, he brought a number of objects with him that he had collected in central Mexico. And somehow John Dee got his hands on this thing. And it was for him a television screen into the Logos, and he used it over a number of years to direct the foreign policy of England. He was the confidant of Queen Elizabeth I, and he also was the most accomplished astrologer in Europe. and he used his ability to cast horoscopes as an entree into all the great houses of Europe, the kings and nobles of Europe. Well, he was functioning as an intelligence agent. He was a spy for the British Crown, insinuating himself into these various courtly scenes and then writing back to Elizabeth in ciphers that had previously only been used for magical purposes. He was sending back data on the strength of military garrisons and the placement of fortifications and this sort of thing. And this was what he was doing in the 1580s. He kept the showstone for a number of years, and he didn't seem to be able to make much progress with it. He had other methods too. He had wax tables and sigils, but finally into his life came a very mysterious character named Edward Kelly. And some accounts say that Edward Kelly had no ears, which indicates that he had had his ears removed for being a charlatan and a mountebank. This was a common punishment in the provinces of England. So Edward Kelly was a very dubious character, I think. For one strong piece of evidence that he was a shady character was John Dee was married to a much younger woman named Anne Dee, who by all accounts was quite a beauty. And after gaining Dee's confidence as a scryer, the person who could look into the showstone and lay out these scenarios that the angels and the entities coming and going in the showstone were putting forth, Kelly revealed to Dee that the angels had instructed him to hit the hay with Anne. And this was a great crisis in their relationship. However, according to Dee's diary, and so it was done, we read. So, hanky-panky didn't begin with the Golden Dawn, believe me. In 1582, Anne Dee, John Dee, and Edward Kelly set out for Bohemia. And Rudolph, the Mad King of Bohemia, held sway at that time. Now, this is another one of these bizarre figures in the whole story of this. Rudolph collected dwarfs. He collected giants. He had what was called a Wunderkammer, a wonder cabinet. You see, before Linnaeus, before modern scientific classification, these great patrons of the arts and natural sciences, they would just collect weird stuff. And that was all you could say about it. I mean, it was rhinoceros horns, fossil ammonites, broken pieces of statues from antiquity, giant insects from southern India, seashells. All this stuff would just be thrown together in these Wunderkammer, these wonder cabinets. And Rudolph was a great patron of the arts. Well, Kelly sent the word that he and Dee had perfected the alchemical process, and Rudolph immediately paid their way to Prague and patronized them very lavishly over a number of months, but then they didn't seem to be coming through. And he ordered a castle put at their disposal in Bohemia, and they still weren't able to come through. The Voynich manuscript figures in here too, because Kelly's entree to Dee was that he had a manuscript in an unknown language. And I believe that this probably was the Voynich manuscript. The Voynich manuscript turns up in the estate of Rudolph, and the very month that he paid 14,000 gold ducats for it to persons unknown, Dee, who was always writing back to the Elizabethan court, hounding them to send money, entered in his account book that they received 14,000 gold ducats from an unknown source. Dee was able to talk himself out of this alchemical imprisonment, but not before he had written a book called The Hieroglyphic Monad. Now you have to understand the importance of this. As late as the 1920s in England, in the better schools of England like Eton, when you studied geometry, you studied Euclid's works. And Euclid's geometry was always preceded by Dee's preface to Euclid. Until the 1920s, every English schoolchild studied this. He was a master mathematician as well as all these other things. This was how he was able to produce these navigation instruments. So Dee, while imprisoned in Bohemia, wrote a book called The Hieroglyphic Monad, in which he proposed to prove through a series of occult theorems that a certain diagram, which unfortunately I didn't bring the hieroglyphic monad, but it's basically the symbol of, the symbol of Mercury, which looks like the symbol for female, but you put horns on it, and then there were some adumbrations to that. By a series of theorems, he built up this hieroglyphic monad, and he initiated a couple of young men named Johann Andrei and Michael Meyer into the mysteries of the hieroglyphic monad. Well, then he was able to get out of Bohemia, and he went back to England. Kelly, who had made much more extravagant claims, Rudolph kept at work on the alchemical opus, and Kelly became more and more desperate to escape. And one night in 1587, he crept out on the parapet of this Bohemian castle, and a roof tile slipped beneath his feet, and he fell to his death and became, so far as I can tell, alchemy's only true martyr. Well, Dee returned to England, and he was now very old, and he died at Mortlake in 1606. Elizabeth died in 1604. Shakespeare was happening. Sir Philip Sidney was happening through this period. John Dee reputedly had over 6,000 books in his library. He had more books than any man in England. He had books, we have a partial catalog of his library. He had books that do not exist now. He had Roger Bacon manuscripts, because you see, when Henry VIII kicked the Catholic Church out of England, the Northumbrian monasteries were looted by the Earl of Northumberland, and basically Dee was allowed to pick over the loot from these monasteries, and there were Roger Bacon manuscripts which perished when Dee's library was burned by an angry mob while he was on the continent, because he was suspected of being a wizard. He was the model for Faust in the later recensions of Faust. And whenever you see an old man with a white beard and a pointed cap, this image is really referent to Dee. Well, Elizabeth died in 1604, I believe, and James the First became King of England. And James was a peculiar character. The wags of the time liked to say, Elizabeth was king, and now James is queen. And not only that, he hated occultism. He had no patience with the whole magical court that Elizabeth had assembled around herself. Well, now, meanwhile, in 1606, a very mysterious document began to circulate in Europe and in England called the Fama. This is the first word of a string of Latin words, the Fama, and 2 years later, the Confessio. And what these were announcements that an alchemical brotherhood was seeking recruits. These are the primary documents of Rosicrucianism. Now, Rosicrucianism was based on a fiction and a fictional person, Christian Rosenkranz, who was imagined to have lived almost 200 years earlier, in the 1540s, and been a great alchemist. And it was claimed that his tomb had been recently opened and that there were books inside it which set the stage for the alchemical revolution of the world. Notice how this occult mind always tries to reach back in time to give itself validity. So, and Christian Rosenkranz was claimed to be the author of a series of books, the chief of which is called The Chemical Wedding. What this was all about, I believe, and the Rosicrucian Enlightenment makes it fairly clear, was Dee, during the period when he had been in Bohemia, had set out to lay the groundwork for an alchemical revolution in Central Europe. And he had made Johann Andrei and Michael Meyer his agents in this plot. And it was a plot to meddle with European history and to turn the Protestant Reformation toward an alchemical completion. They felt that Luther and Huss and these people had only gone so far, and that the culmination of throwing off the yoke of the church would be the establishment of an alchemical kingdom in Central Europe. The target then of the attention of Michael Meyer and Johann Andrei and a number of these alchemists became the young Frederick, he's called Frederick the Elector Palatine. He was a prince of the Northern League in Germany. He ruled in Heidelberg. And Heidelberg, as you know, is a 1,000-year-old university city. And I believe I mentioned that the alchemical press of Theodor de Bry was operating out of Heidelberg. Heidelberg became a magnet for all the occult thinking going on in Europe. And all the puffers and alchemists, the gold makers, the philosophers, the charlatans, they all converged on Heidelberg. And Andrei and Meyer were advisors of the young Frederick. And they steered him by a series of political manipulations too complex to tell toward a marriage with the daughter of James I of England, who was named Elizabeth, interestingly enough. So Frederick the Elector made Elizabeth, the son of James of England, his wife. Now, Frederick here made a serious miscalculation, because he thought that if James would give the hand of his daughter in marriage, that this was his way of blessing this alchemical conspiracy. Actually, what was on James's mind was he was about to give one of his sons in marriage to a Spanish princess of the Habsburg line, a Catholic. In other words, he was playing both sides against each other. He was not giving the green light to an alchemical revolution at all. But it was assumed so. Well, then in 16, 17, 18, Rudolph, remember Rudolph, the emperor? He finally dies at a very ripe old age. And at that time, the Protestant League, which was made up of these princes, of these small principalities scattered across Germany and Poland, they actually elected the emperor. It was not by right of primogeniture, but by election by what was called the Northern League, this group of princes. Frederick and his alchemical cohorts had done their political groundwork very, very skillfully, and they were able to engineer the election of Frederick to emperor of the empire. And he became Frederick the Elector Palatine of Bohemia. And this set the stage for an episode called the episode of the Winter King and Queen, one of the great after Nicholas and Pertinel Flamel, this is one of the great romantic stories of alchemy. They moved their court from Heidelberg to Prague, and all the alchemists went with them, and they assumed that English armies would support them if there was any squawk from the Habsburgs. And the winter of 1618, they ruled there and began to lay the groundwork for the transformation of Northern Europe into an alchemical kingdom. The problem was, as I said, the faithlessness and duplicity of James I of England. He did not support them, in spite of the fact that the fate of his daughter hung in the balance. And by May of 1619, the local bishop of the Catholic Church was fully aroused, and word had been sent to Madrid, and the Habsburgs raised an army and lay siege to Prague. And in the late summer, in the midsummer of 1619, the Winter King and Queen were driven from Prague, and the city fell to Catholic forces. The alchemical presses were smashed, and Michael Meyer, who was like the prime minister of this scene, was murdered in an alley of Prague, and the entire alchemical dream went down the drain. Frederick was killed in the siege of the city, and Elizabeth escaped to The Hague, where she lived in exile for many years. Well, until recently, I thought that was the end of the story, but there is a codex that's or a coda that is amusing, if nothing else. In that Habsburgian army, there was a young soldier of fortune, only 19 years old, still wet behind the ears, knowing nothing, happily soldiering and wenching his way around Europe while he decided what to do with himself. And his name was René Descartes, a Frenchman. And Descartes, in his later years, reminisced about his period as a soldier in this army. And I like to think that it was actually Descartes who murdered Meyer. One of my ambitions is to write a play or a novel where these two confront themselves in a back alley of burning Prague and carry on a debate about the future of Europe before Michael Meyer falls to the sword of Descartes. Well, that may be apocryphal, but what is not apocryphal is that this Habsburgian army, having laid siege and destroyed the alchemical kingdom, began to retreat across Europe that fall, and by mid-September was camped near the town of Ulm in southern Germany. Now, by a strange coincidence, Ulm is the birthplace of Einstein some hundreds of years later. But on the night of September 16th, Descartes had a dream. And in this dream, an angel appeared to him. And this is documented by his own hand. And the angel said to Descartes, "The conquest of nature is to be achieved through measure and number." And that revelation lay the basis for modern science. René Descartes is the founder of the distinction between the res virens and the res extensa, the founder of modern science, the founder of the scientific method that created the philosophical engines that created the modern world. How many scientists working at their workbenches understand that an angel chartered modern science? It's the alchemical angel, which will not die. It returns again and again to guide the destinies of nations and peoples toward an unimaginable conclusion. I mean, that's not the last time that this angelic intervention in the history of science has occurred. Some of you may know the story in the 19th century of Kekule, the German chemist who was struggling with the molecular structure of benzene, couldn't get it straight, and then had a dream in which he saw the Ouroboros snake take its tail in its mouth, and he awoke from that dream with the carbon ring burning in his mind. Well, the carbon ring, the six-sided heptadal form of the carbon ring, is the basis for all organic chemistry. So, and then I mentioned earlier Faraday and Helmholtz and the rise of the electromagnetic field. The point I'm trying to make is that however rational we may assume ourselves to be, however rational we may assume modern science to be, it is all really founded on angelic revelation, demonic intercession, and an extremely mysterious relationship between the human mind and the world of what science calls inert matter, which from this point of view is revealed to be not inert at all, but alive and pregnant with purpose for mankind. The alchemical kingdom of Frederick the Elector, then there were a series of adumbrations of this kind of thinking. I mean, many of you may know about the Freemasonry and the many Freemason revolts in Bohemia and Bavaria throughout the 16th and 17th century. Adam Weishaupt and the Illuminati is another effort to do this. And even the Royal Society, founded by Newton and Hooke and those people, was still an effort to redeem science for the spirit. So the alchemical spirit lives on. It never really died. It's just that it has taken peculiar forms in our own day. And I mentioned, I think last night, that when you enter into nuclear chemistry, the most literal dreams of the profane side of alchemy, the transformation of lead into gold, has actually been achieved. I mean, it has no economic significance because the instrumentality to do it costs tens of millions of dollars. But nevertheless, yes, lead in our time has been changed into gold.